Hey, welcome. My name is Zach Garrett, and I'm the education manager for United World Wrestling. And I'd just like to welcome each of you to today's webinar. This is the third webinar in our series on developing training plans. The first two webinars, we took a look at what training plans are and why they're important. And then last webinar, we took a look at risk management within training plans, like how can we effectively reduce the risk by how we make training plans. So that's what we covered the last two. Today, we're going to be taking a look at another topic here, which is the theoretical framework. And this is kind of taking all of the different things we need to think about and sometimes even putting them down on paper before we actually start designing the plan of like these 10 minutes we're doing this, these 20 minutes we're doing this, etc. So this is more of like an overall framework that we need to consider as we're making that training plan. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. The first thing we'll draw your attention to here is what's called the strategic planning cycle. And this really is just, in general, a strategic planning cycle is very similar in nature. And that's what we're going to be looking at over the course of this webinar. Because many of these things are what we really need to think about and to consider before we actually start writing out our plan. You know, for example, what are our goals? So like, what do we want to accomplish? And what are those desired outcomes? Once you get done with the practice, what are you hoping to accomplish? That's what we're taking a look at with, as we get started here. Then we move into, once we know what we want or we want to accomplish, next we take a look at what are those strategies? What are those activities that we need to do to help us get to that point? And then once we know that, the next part is, as a coach, I need to think about what are those measures and those targets? How do I know that I reached that goal? How do I know if those wrestlers are able to do what we ask them to do or what we want them to get better at that day? What are our measures and targets going to be? Then we have to take a look at our results, think about how we can improve, and then we start this process over again. So many of the things that you see in the strategic planning cycle here are topics and areas that we're going to get into more detail as we move through this webinar. But I think this is a great place to start and just kind of an overview of what's such an important part of when we get into planning. What are those main topic areas that we need to consider before we even get started? So there's some key questions that we want to be able to answer, and certainly hope the goal of this webinar is to help you answer each of these questions before we get done. The first question here is, what are your season or yearly goals? Like, and I'm not sure what those may be for you, but I think it's important to start thinking about, one, do you have those? And then two, how do you figure out what those are going to be? So we'll talk about, get into that in some detail. Also, what are the three main concepts that are needed identified in each practice plan? There's three areas that we have to consider, and some we've already talked about in previous webinars, but there's three main concepts that we need to consider, write down, make sure we understand before we move forward to writing our practice plan out. The next question that's going to drive us here in this webinar is, how are objectives and activities determined? How do we determine which drills, which live segments, what are we going to do in that process? The next one is, how much time is needed for practice? I know for myself, this is often the area that I start with first, is how long do I have for practice for that particular day? And then work around that part. And then the last one is, how can we use past practice plans to help design new ones? So these are going to be our guiding questions for the webinar today. And again, our goal at the end of this is hopefully to be able to answer these more clearly to help you get prepared to develop an outstanding, training plan for a session. One of the early webinars I talked about how practice planning, when you're making a practice plan, how it's a mixture of, it's an art and it's a science. The science part is what you see on the screen here. It's listing all the things down. Like what are the different types of activities we can do? Like we can easily find all the activities that are out there, and even you can create your own activities if you want to. Determining what developmental stage they're in. There's characteristics, there's information on the long-term athlete development model. Practice times for age groups. That's also, there's a lot of data that's out there that will help you determine what's best for your situation. But it's a mixture. It's just not science. And having all of these things as a coach, and you're designing a plan based on these, is good. But as a coach, you also have to have one more thing, which is some intuition. A coach has to be able to take a look at all of the different things they have and then blend together a great practice plan. And everybody's is going to look different. And that's why this webinar is entitled Theoretical Framework, because there's an overlying framework that we can use to help us develop a practice plan. But a practice plan that I develop isn't going to look the same as a practice plan that you develop, because your situation is going to be different. You have different objectives. You want to do some different activities. That's perfect. But we have to understand that there's an overall framework that we can use, and then we have to take all that and then think, how does that best work for our situation? And that's where that intuition comes into play. And we have to take all that stuff that we learn and blend it together. Which activities are we going to pick? How long are we going to practice? How are we going to modify this activity to work with different developmental stages? Those are all things as a coach you have to kind of blend together in order to have a very successful practice plan. The next part here is taking a look at season and yearly goals. Do you have those? I would say I would start out with these two questions as you get started. What do you want to improve, and what do you want to accomplish? Whether you operate year to year or maybe just a season. I know, for example, like I operate typically in a season because the team that I work with pretty much operates from November until February. That's when I have that group of athletes, and we're going to be working through that with competitions along the way. And so each time we take a look at what are the areas that we really want to improve going into that season and over the course of that season. And then what are our goals that we're hoping to accomplish at the end of this? All right, so I think it's important that we start with what that is, because that's going to help guide you when you're developing those practice plans, is making sure you understand what it is you want to accomplish at the end of this process. I like to do that, kind of start with the end in mind and then work backwards a little bit. Next one is, how are these goals developed? That's a great question. I think there's two ways in which we can do this. Number one, we can simply take an analysis from the previous year. We many times we have the same athletes from year to year, and we simply take a look at what they were doing last year. What are the areas that we want to improve? What are those competitions that we want to, results that we want to have at the end of the season or during the course of a year? And we take a look at that and we use that to help set our goals for the upcoming year. Also, another way you can do that, let's say you have somebody that's new to your program and you don't know that much about them. One area, especially with younger athletes, is to make a test at the beginning of the season. Whenever you begin your season, start with a simple test and measure their level in a variety of different places. Their wrestling technique skills, their footwork, their ability to be able to move, change levels. And you can simply make a test at the beginning to give you some initial data, and then that data then can help you set what those goals are going to be for the year. And one thing I would probably encourage this as well is, many times we look at this from a team perspective, what are we doing with all of the athletes? But a lot of times this is going to be different from individual to individual. I know that when we look at it with our team, we have such a wide range of grouping of athletes that one wrestler's goals aren't going to be the same as the other wrestler's goals. So we're going to have to figure out practice plans that work best for this person versus somebody else. So when you're looking at season and yearly goals, those could be team-based, but they also could be individual-based, or maybe you can make them into smaller groups. But I think one thing we have to do is we have to start with the season and yearly goals. What are the things that we want to improve? What are the things that we want to accomplish? And we need to know those before we start designing our practice plans. I think before we get started as well, there's 3 starting concepts that we really need to consider. The first one is the safety and risk management piece. This is what I covered in the last webinar. We went through a lot of different things about how to reduce risk and how to keep our athletes safe. Because as a coach, that is our #1 responsibility, is to ensure the safety of our athletes. We need to make sure that they're safe, they're healthy, and no matter what training we're doing, what competitions we're going to, safety must be a priority as a coach. And that's what we talked about in the last webinar. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to watch that webinar, to go into United World Wrestling, webinar page, find this webinar and watch it, because I go through and talk about ways in which we can help reduce risk that might occur during the course of practice. And we do that by planning, not when we're there. The next part of our starting concepts that we need to know is the growth and developmental stage of our athletes. This is the physical, intellectual, social, and emotional characteristics that come with maybe specific age groups or with certain levels of athletes. And as a coach, it's our job to know what group of athletes that we're coaching. Where are they currently at in that long-term athlete development model? We want to take a look at what their wrestling IQ is. Just because they may be younger, within our program here, I've got some wrestlers who are 10, 12 years old who have a much higher wrestling IQ than those that are 16 and 17. Just because they've been wrestling for a number of years, they're kind of at a different place. So as a coach, we need to take into account where are they at, age-wise, growth, their wrestling IQ, what developmental stage they're at, and I need to factor that in to when I'm making practice plans, because I need to know that, because I have to be able to create variations in my practices to be able to accommodate the wrestlers in the room. Because if I just do a one-size-fits-all approach, that's going to work for just a small percentage of them, but I've got to be able to have modifications to either improve the best wrestlers or to help just teach the basics to the newer ones. So we have to really take into light, what is our growth and developmental stage as a coach? And you do that by identifying, observing them at practice as you're going through, and that will help you guide those practices going forward. The last one here that we got to consider, that you need to consider as a coach, is your coaching philosophy. How many people have actually written down a coaching philosophy statement? This identifies kind of what you believe as a coach. How do you want to operate as a coach? In a coaching philosophy, you see the individual's core values, what they believe, what's most important to them. And it helps you answer that one question of, why do you coach? I think if we understand what our coaching philosophy is, that helps us be able to prepare practices that fit our coaching philosophy. Because I think that's an important part, is making sure that you understand yourself better in order to be able to develop practice plans. If one of your goals is just to, you want to teach the sport, you love the sport of wrestling, but you want to make sure that you are just raising the athletes to become better individuals. We want them to be good wrestlers, I get that, but one of our key focuses is just becoming a better person and learning what it takes to be successful in all walks of life. If that's one of your values, your core values, then as a result, you're going to plan practices a little bit differently, and should. It's different if you're trying to be an Olympic champion versus if you're just trying to develop an athlete to become a better person. And I think we have to keep that in mind, because that's going to help us develop our plans that we want to. I think there's also a technical and tactical side that comes with this, in terms of what are those things that you believe in for scoring points, where are you going to kind of spend your time on. But I think that also comes, we have to also consider what our values are and why do we coach in that process. But we need to take a look at all three of these concepts and have some of these really probably should be written down, so you know this before you start designing your plan. The next one here is determining your session objectives. And I mean session, like that particular practice. What do you hope to gain in this practice? What do you want to accomplish? And I think we have to really take a look at it. What's the overall goal? And I think it really depends on how much time you have for practice. If you only have 45 minutes to an hour, you're probably not going to be able to accomplish a lot of things, and nor should you try to accomplish a lot of things. But you have to figure out what's most important and what is it that you want to get done. I think it really gets broken down. Most objectives get broken down into one of four areas. The first one here is conditioning. Just that's the physical conditioning, getting in shape to be able to wrestle. Another objective might be for practice is to work on the mental preparation of an athlete. You know, when you get into the tapering phase of right before a big competition, the mental part of this is just as important as any other part. And maybe that practice objective is to work on that mental preparation. You know, two other areas are obviously tactics and techniques. You know, what is it that you want to improve in those areas? But again, I think you have to really look at what is it you want to accomplish and then have those. It's just like setting goals. You know, I'm setting a goal and here's what I want to accomplish with this goal. The key is don't have too many. Don't say I'm going to get all of these things done in one practice. Figure out what's most important. This is what we want to accomplish in this maybe one of these 4 areas, and this is how we're going to do it. You know, but having down what you want to accomplish first is important. Because keep in mind, this is not just a list of activities. Like if I want to say, okay, I want to work on tactics, or I'm going to write down all the different things that I want to do. That is not what this is. Determining your session objectives is deciding what you want to accomplish. Like here's what we want to get better at. We want to be able to score on our feet, you know, from a 2-on-1. That's the objective. You know, we're doing a technical aspect of this, and we're going to score from a 2-on-1. So everything we do will be centered around scoring offense from a 2-on-1 position. So it's not a list of activities, it's what you want to accomplish. And by doing this, by writing this down on your practice plan, is going to give you direction, and it's going to help outline the potential outcomes you're going to get from this practice. And I think anytime, again, just like having goals give you direction. They help you know where you want to go and how you get there. So start by setting your goal for your practice first, and then work to the next part. That next part is determining the activities. Now that we know what our goal is, our objective, you know, maybe 1 or 2 objectives that we want to cover for this practice that we want to accomplish, now we have to start determining what activities we're going to do in that process. Now, as we talk about this, like, you're literally hearing me go through the exact process I go through as I'm developing practice plans. This is what I did yesterday. I went through and decided what it was we wanted to accomplish, you know, with the 2 workouts we had this coming week. I got on our objective, what our goal was, and then I started thinking, okay, what are the activities that are going to help us get to that goal? All right. So determining activities, and I think our activities can be broken down into 3 categories. There's technique and tactical activities, there's physical training activities, and mental training. Now, when we say technical and tactical, this is just your ability to improve their wrestling skills. You know, this is wrestling, specifically wrestling related techniques, tactics, etc., but you're improving their wrestling skills with this. The physical training activities are really, there's a variety of things that come into play here. This takes a look at, this could include how to develop strength and improving your conditioning. All right, so it's just not one aspect, but it could be more. You know, we can get stronger. Sometimes at practice, we're doing a workout where we're trying to build strength in this process. This also, in that physical training, involves the warm-up and the cool-down. And also we can include our ability, you know, our flexibility, our stretching, and then also our ability for movement, like just improving our overall general movement falls under that physical training. It doesn't have to be wrestling specific, but it will help those wrestling specific things because we're working on physical training aspect. And then the third one here is the mental training. And mental training is designed to help develop the soft skills of the wrestler. You know, these aren't the hard wrestling skills, but it's the ability to be able to handle adversity. How do they handle adversity and be able to thrive from it? How do they deal with anxiety? You know, how do we get them, put them in situations where they can overcome those things? So know that some activities we have are designed to challenge them mentally as much as it is the other 2 areas. Now, an important part to consider with this is, though, you know, the activities that you do many times fall under more than one category. I know that like we have a number of different drills that we do that could fall under multiple places. For example, if I am doing a drill called 4-man drilling, so I put athletes in groups of 4, and then we're going to just one person is in for 1 minute. I can make this is a physical training exercise because during that 1 minute, that person is going really hard. but we're working on a technical action. So it's a technical skill as well. So we can look at it, these activities can often hit more than one of these categories, all right? But what's important to know is that each activity should have its own objective. Just because it falls under multiple categories doesn't mean the goal of that activity on that day is to encompass all of them. You know, as a side part, you might gain some of that, but you have to figure out what that one objective is. For example, if I'm doing that drill, I do 4-man drilling. Some days I want that strictly to be physical conditioning. Like we're doing this as a conditioning activity. And if we can pick up the technical aspect of it, that's okay. But I'm not going to get on them too much about whether they executed a double leg correctly. What I want them is hitting as many double legs as they can in 1 minute. So the technique, we want the technique to be good, but the goal of that activity that particular day is conditioning. Like I'm working on the physical training aspect of it. Whereas other days, we might do the same 4-man drill, but the goal in this time is going to be more on the the tactical aspect of it. Because we do a drill called easy in, hard out. So we allow the wrestler who's in for that 1 minute go is going to make a leg attack of whatever we tell them. We say, okay, you're going to do a single leg. So they attack with a single leg. So it's easy for them to get into the single leg, but then their partner that they're practicing with has to make it difficult for them to finish. So now they have to figure out the tactical part of it, along with some technical aspects, to be able to finish successful. Now they're doing this as many times as they can get in a minute, but the reality is they're probably not going to get very many reps this time because we're working on that technical tactical aspect of it. So it's not meant to be conditioning, and it's meant to be one part. Now I might get both a little bit, like I might still get a little conditioning and physical training as a part of it, but the goal of that activity is not from that aspect. So even though we might have different drills, different activities that we do that fall under multiple different groupings, keep in mind that every activity we do should have its own objective. And if you can't figure out what the objective is for that activity, then it's probably not worth doing. You know, don't just do an activity to do an activity. Make sure there's always a goal with it that goes behind it. Another part that I think is important to consider, and a lot of times I actually start with this, you know, I have those other parts, the 3 starting concepts. That's kind of my overall guiding light that I have that's going to help guide me when I make practices. And that stuff doesn't change a lot from day to day. But what does change is how long do we practice? Like how long do I have them on any given day for that training session? And so when we look at that, there's actually just a little bit of science and there's some things behind this that are at least we need to consider when we're developing how long do we practice with each athlete. In general, younger the wrestler, the less time practicing. Like I just know from being able to control, you know, just that age group itself, that when you start getting too long, it becomes very difficult for them to be able to focus and retain as they go. They have a limited amount of time. So the younger the wrestler you have, the less time you want to spend practicing. I also think you can adjust practice times based on where you're at within your training cycle. You know, as you progress and get closer to the bigger competitions, your time's going to reduce too. All right. Now, how do we determine the times, the relative times, or what's a good idea time frame for different age groups? So this grouping is compiled from a couple of places, and this is not the only place you can find this information as well, but this comes from the US Youth Soccer Association along with USA Wrestling. So it kind of merged together into this age group and the length of practice time. So you can see that as they're younger, there's less time involved. I know if I'm working with athletes that are under the age of 8, 45 minutes to an hour is the maximum amount of time I can spend with them. All right, as they get older, they're able to concentrate and focus a little longer, so the practice times get a little bit longer as they go. You know, I typically coach between 15 and 18-year-olds, you know, during my time. And I would say that consistently our practices are somewhere between that 75 minutes to 120 minutes on any given day. Kind of depends on where we're at within our training cycle, but I really don't exceed much more than 2 hours with that group of athletes. You know, and we try to break those things up as you go. But I think just knowing how much time you can spend with them is an important part of this. And this is just a guideline. These aren't, set in stone. You have to follow these, but these just give you an idea of how long each age group should probably be practicing. Now, another important part that's up here, which is the far right column where you see the total time per week. The total time per week, and this is really important for children. Right? If we're looking at a very young age groups, under 12 and so on, the time that they spend doing wrestling activities should be no longer than their age. So, for example, I have up here on the slide, if they're 9 years old, they should spend no more than 9 hours doing wrestling in any given week. All right, so for every age, that equals an hour. This includes training and competitions. So over the course of a week, maybe you have 2 or 3 training sessions that, let's say, are an hour apiece. So you have 3 hours of training. Now, if they go to a competition on the weekend, how long does that competition last? Because it doesn't mean that they're spent time doing the sport. They're not practicing, they're not wrestling for 9 hours. They're involved in some aspect with that sport for 9 hours. So if you have a competition that's, let's say, 6 hours long, because we know if we go to some competitions, you wrestle, you wait a little while, they wrestle again, you wait a little while, wrestle again. It takes time to get through that. All right, so overall, their time there is going to be longer than how much they actually participate. And so I think we need to make sure that we really consider how much time are they spending each week, because this isn't so much important from them getting overworked as much as it is important is we don't want them to get burned out. Wrestling can be a very demanding sport, and if they're spending, let's say they're 9 years old and they're doing something with wrestling for 15 hours a week, that might be all right for a year or two, but over time they start getting tired of doing that and they want to do other things, and as a result, they stop participating. And what I can tell you is that the younger age groups at 12 years old, they're not going to be an Olympic champion at 12 years old. But if they're not around after they're 12, we know they're not going to be an Olympic champ. So it's important to make sure that we keep them around for the long term, because we know as coaches how much benefit you get from participating in wrestling, that we want to be able to keep them for longer time period. And if we stick to that total time per week, I think that will help keep athletes around, even beyond as they become older. Now, as you see, when you get older into that 16 to 20 and beyond, the time per week varies because they're obviously going to be more, focused on what they're doing wrestling wise, and they have some goals they want to accomplish. So as a result, they might require more time to do that. The next part here is taking a look at just reflecting back on practice plans. I think after every practice, a coach should take time to reflect on how the session went. I can tell you, I actually coach another sport right now during this time period. And after every practice, the group of coaches that I coach with, we sit down afterwards and say, okay, what went well? What do we need to change anything as we go into the next practice? And we have those conversations and we spend time reflecting on how it went. Because this is a good time to evaluate what went well and what needs to be changed. As a wrestling coach, that's important. And by documenting this down, it will help better prepare you in the future. I mean, that's what we do. Like, we have a practice plan, here's what we write, and then I just make notes in the practice plan, and I actually have a notepad that has all my practice plans in it for that season, and I just make notes on it. This was good, this wasn't good. Hey, for the next time, we need to work on this. But this allows you to really take a chance to go back and think about what was good and how could it be done differently. So that way you can design a better practice plan in the future. So this is such a critical step. And I think that one thing by doing this, if you get really good at doing this and taking time to reflect and make notes, this will help you, from practice to practice, but it's also going to help you from year to year. Like, I keep every notepad that I have a notepad for every year that has the practices in it. And I will go back through that and look through what we did on specific days just to see what we did, what worked well as you go. Because the one thing is you kind of go, is these things help guide you It doesn't mean that's exactly what you're going to do, but they help guide you and put you in a better position to be successful. I can tell you from year to year, I have a changeover of athletes. Like I have athletes that once they become beyond 18, they move on to the next level. And then I have new athletes that are coming in as 15-year-olds. So I have a different dynamic every year. So what we did from year to year will help guide me, but that doesn't mean that's exactly what we're going to do year to year. But I think taking time to reflect on what you do will help you make changes to the next practice, will help you make changes to the practices, in the next week, and then even, be able to consider those from year to year. And I love the quote that's up here. We do not learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. And I think that's a really critical aspect of it. I say, oh, you gain a lot from just getting the experience. Well, we only gain it if we take time to think about it. So these are some of the main concepts that we have within this theoretical framework. At this time, before I wrap this up and kind of pull it all together, now's the time that if you have any specific questions, I saw a few hands, raised during that time. If you have any questions, please, feel free to write them in the question and answer box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And I will certainly do my best to go through and answer those questions, and also can give you some examples of things that, I do in terms of getting prepared for designing practice plans. All right, I don't have any questions yet, so I'm going to go ahead and go to this next part. And if you have a question, please feel free to populate it up, and I'll go through and answer those. So the first question, do you have examples of periodized training? So in terms of periodized training, we are in the process, I can tell you, of developing a course on periodization, like how that works. In terms of, personal examples of periodization, we often, like with wrestling, have that one or two big events at the end of the year. And so we're really working as we progress through that as we go. Our first 2 months because I operate basically on a 4-month window. So everything's kind of in 4-month blocks. In that 4-month block, of those first 2 months, we really spend kind of on general preparation. We're just learning we're getting better, improving our techniques. We're increasing our volume during that time. We're getting a lot of repetitions. Our intensity starts to go up during that time as we progress through those first 2 months. And then we start getting in towards the end of that, we start getting into more situational, activities as we go. Same thing with when it's periodization. It's just not related to wrestling, but it's skills, but also your physical conditioning part of that as well. Like you're working your way up to that process as well. So during those first 2 months, we have competitions, we're wrestling, we're practicing, we're doing those things, but we really focus a lot on that, that teaching aspect of it and making sure that we get really good at doing the areas that we're going to do. So we practice, we get a lot of reps, and that's our high volume, and our intensity goes up over time. So it starts low and then starts to increase when it gets to that, towards the end of those 2 months. When we get into the next month, our 3rd month in, we take a look at a lot of our athletes. What we do is we actually develop individual practice plans for those athletes that they will operate on certain days. Certain days, I want you to work on this, and this is designed specifically for you, because it allows them to get in, because now we're in that specific preparation phase, and now they're working on things that are just predicated for them. Because not every wrestler, now many of the best wrestlers can do all the moves, but the reality is they get really good at a few. And so what we focus on is when we get to that month in, we've watched them wrestle for the last 2 months. Now we're able to narrow down specifically what are the areas we want them to work on. And we have them working on specific areas, specific situations. During this time, we're also starting to build up our conditioning level to where we can wrestle multiple matches in one day. And we're continually increasing our volume and our intensity, with that aspect of it. Now, as we start to progress through this, we start to drop the volume because we don't need to get so many reps because we got a lot of reps before, but we really start to pick up our intensity level as we go. So our practices start to shorten a little bit, but they're a little bit more intense. And even within that course, because I'm at a luxury that we practice every day and the days that we're not competing. So the only day that we're off is Sunday. So throughout the course of a week, we're going to practice 4, if not 5 times before we compete. So during that course that week, we'll often, increase a little bit, and then we'll drop a little, drop the intensity, because you can't just keep making the intensity difficult, or they'll get burned out really quickly. So we do a lot of varying those workouts throughout the course of a week. And then when we get towards the end of the season, that last month is when we get into that pre-competition and competition phases, where we really have shortened the practice times. It's very specific to what we're working on, those individuals are working on. The intensity is really high. We're dropping the volume. We're shortening practice, but it's a really intense and practice. And then we kind of start that at the front of the week. We taper a little bit at the end of the week, and then we go compete. And then we work towards, because we have a 4-week tournament series at the end. We wrestle each week, so we have to peak towards the end. So that's a little bit of examples that I have on periodization that I've done. But certainly, I think there's a lot of information out there, and periodization is a framework in itself. There's a lot of things that you can do that can be successful, and it has a lot to do with the type of athlete that you have. So I would encourage you to be on the lookout over the next couple months. We should have an online course on the United World Wrestling Academy page that is designed for strictly periodization. And then eventually we'll get into a series of topics, webinars, looking at periodization and how that can be implemented in more detail. So kind of pulling everything together that we talked about. When we look at the theoretical framework, I think a lot of times we're taking all of this information that we need to know and think about before we even start doing that. I know before I actually make a practice plan, I make a lot of notes on different activities. What are the goals? What are the 3 or 4 areas that I really want to accomplish this coming week? And I list all that stuff down. That's the theoretical framework. The design of the practice plan is taking that information and then putting it into, all right, for these 10 minutes, we're doing a warm up. For the next 10 minutes, we're going to be drilling double legs. That's the practice plan. The theoretical framework is all the notes and all the thought process that goes in before you get to that part. A lot of times as we do this, like for me, as I mentioned, I'll start with the time. I know roughly how much time I want to go because I know how long my practice is going to be. Then I start setting, okay, what's the objective that I want to accomplish that day? Once I have the objectives, the next thing I go into is listing the activities that I want to do with that. And then once I have those, then I start putting them into time frames. But it's taking all of the stuff that we had, that I just kind of went through and talked about, and we're putting it all on the front end of this before we start designing that. And it even goes back to looking at, okay, what did we do last week? What worked? What didn't work? What do we need to build off that? And again, that's just that reflection piece that always comes into play too. So all of what we kind of covered today is just the thought process that goes behind what it takes to design a practice plan. So take some of this information, make some notes, write down as much stuff, then sit down and then design your plan after you have those things done. If you do that, you'll find that your plans are going to be better, you're going to be more efficient, and you're going to get more out of them. And the last thing that I'll leave you with here is this quote, and I love this. It says, strategic thinking rarely occurs spontaneously. When you're trying to design practices, it doesn't just happen because all of a sudden you're just thinking and it's there. You have to actually dedicate time for, here's what I'm going to do this. Here's what I'm going to start thinking about these ideas. I'm going to start writing them down. And because you make the time to think about it, that allows you to develop ideas and come up with a really good plan. But it's not going to happen by itself. You actually need to schedule time for when you're going to do that. I do that every weekend. I have workouts the upcoming week. I know that I'm going to spend a couple hours just thinking about what it is we want to accomplish, what activities we're going to do. And then once I have those down, then I start putting the time frames that go with it. So I encourage you to take time to do that. So again, thank you for taking time to be here today. I really appreciate your attention and being here. And certainly if you have any questions in the future, please reach out to me. You can go to United World Wrestling, go to Development Department, and you'll be able to find my contact information. And I'd also encourage you to go to the United World Wrestling Academy website. It's like a source of education, and we're just adding and trying to improve it, day by day. And you can certainly reach out to me via that way as well, on that platform. So again, thanks for being here today, and I hope you have a great day and stay safe.